48 years old, with her reputation turned to ash, and exactly $320 in her coat pocket, money earned penny by penny through mending and piecework, Eleanor Cassidy stood at the edge of Copper Reach, Michigan, on a November morning in 1891, and regarded the lighthouse that had been sealed and dark for 7 years. The town's founding family, the Hardings, had orchestrated the dismissal of her husband, Thomas, from his position as harbor master, on a charge of gross negligence that she knew, with the certainty of someone who had loved him, was a fabrication. When he died 2 years later of pneumonia and a broken heart, Eleanor inherited nothing but his destroyed name. The lighthouse now stood abandoned, its great Fresnel lens gathering dust behind salt-crusted glass, its spiral stairs a passage to nothing. The county assessor offered it to her for $75, a price so contemptible it was almost an affront. The town laughed when she bought it, laughed louder still when she climbed those spiral stairs for the first time and disappeared into the lamproom for an hour. But what Eleanor found sealed behind the brass housings of that ancient lens, preserved in oilcloth and leather by hands decades gone, would not merely restore her own name to dignity, it would force Copper Reach to reckon with what its most respected family had buried, and in doing so, would illuminate a truth that had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone broken enough to listen. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Cassidy, and what she discovered when she dared to tend a light that no one else believed was worth keeping. If you're watching from a place that feels forgotten, or where your name has been taken from you, we would like to hear your story in the comments below. Eleanor Cassidy had grown up in a house where silence was not absence, but presence, a living thing that occupied the rooms alongside her mother, her father, and her younger brother James. Her father, John Cassidy, had been the keeper of the lighthouse at Copper Reach before the light was extinguished, a man whose life was organized around duty and the turning of great mechanisms. He believed that a lighthouse served a purpose that transcended the merely mechanical. It was a promise made to the desperate, a covenant written in light across dark water. He would stand in the lamproom and explain to young Eleanor how the Fresnel lens worked, how it took a single flame and fractured it into something vast and reaching, something that could pull a lost ship toward safety. "A small light, Eleanor," he would tell her, his hand warm on her shoulder, "is greater than great darkness, if someone is patient enough to tend it." Her mother, Catherine, had taught her to read the ledgers her father kept, the meticulous daily records of weather and ships sighted, the condition of the mechanism, and the quality of the oil. Eleanor had inherited from both of them the understanding that small, careful work, the kind that left no mark on the world, that asked for no reward, was the truest form of virtue. By the time she was 14, she could repair the great lens, could maintain the mechanism of the light itself, could read her father's handwriting in a ledger as easily as she read his face. She had learned that precision and care were not separate from kindness. They were its truest expression. She had married Thomas at 22, a man who worked in harbor administration, who carried his own quiet integrity like a lantern through the compromises of small-town commerce. Thomas believed that keeping accurate records, maintaining fair dealing, and speaking truth in matters of trade was the only way a harbor town could build something lasting. They had not been wealthy, but they had been respected. Eleanor had poured her care into the school, where she taught the children of Copper Reach to read and cipher, and understand that words and numbers were tools of liberation. The children had loved her, because she had loved them, and had shown them that precision was kindness. She had been a good teacher. Parents had told her so. Then, in the autumn of 1883, everything transformed in the space of a single ledger discrepancy. The harbor master's records, which Thomas had kept with his usual exactitude, showed that a shipment of refined copper ingots, incoming from the mines upstate, had gone missing. An investigation was opened. The Hardings, who owned the copper mines and 3 of the 6 warehouses in town, announced that Thomas Cassidy had been negligent, possibly corrupt, certainly unfit for his post. They called for his immediate removal. Thomas tried to defend himself by asking for a deeper investigation, but the Hardings forestalled it. Within a month, he was dismissed. Within 3 months, he was dead. Eleanor had spent the 2 years after his death in suspended disbelief, expecting that truth would somehow emerge, that the town would realize what she already knew, that her husband was innocent, that he had been made a scapegoat because someone else had stolen. But years passed, and no truth emerged. Eleanor learned that innocence is not protection, and that the wives of disgraced men are disgraced by association, and that this town, for all its quiet beauty, had chosen to believe a comfortable lie rather than excavate an uncomfortable truth. The work dried up slowly. Then all at once, Eleanor was let go from the school. Families stopped bringing her mending. The boarding house would no longer rent to her. She was forced to move to the outskirts, to a cottage belonging to an elderly widow, for which she received only room and a small stipend. She took piecework from the textile mills, work paid by the finished item, where no one needed to know your name. Her hands learned to work faster, to move with mechanical precision. She had saved. She had planned nothing, because planning required hope, and hope felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. But she had saved, carefully, methodically, for 7 long years. It was during the 7th winter of her solitude that Eleanor learned the lighthouse was for sale. Old Lighthouse Point had been abandoned since her father's death, its mechanism left to rust, its records sealed by county order. A newer lighthouse, electric and efficient, had been built at the harbor's eastern point, rendering the old one obsolete. The county wanted it gone, or wanted someone to claim it, and since no one would, they priced it to almost nothing. Eleanor walked out to it on a gray morning, carrying the list of properties from the assessor. She did not know why she was going. Some memory of her father, perhaps. Some need to see the place where he had believed that small lights mattered. The keeper's cottage was completely deteriorated. Its roof collapsed, its walls water-stained and crumbling. But the lighthouse itself, for all its abandonment, maintained a kind of dignity. Its stone was still sound. Its spiral stairs, when she tested them, were still navigable. She returned to the assessor's office and paid $75. A few people noticed. The jokes spread instantly. Mad Eleanor. Cassidy's folly. You'd think the women in that family understood when to quit. On the day after the deed was finalized, Eleanor climbed the stairs with intention, carrying a lamp and a cleaning cloth, and a sense that she had been drawn to this place for a reason that would become clear. She climbed past the keeper's quarters, past the watchroom, up into the lamp room itself, where the great Fresnel lens stood like a crown. She dusted it carefully, running her cloth over its glass panels, and then she noticed something. The brass housings at its base had a small seam, a plate that seemed removable. It had taken her a quarter-hour of careful work to loosen it, to understand that it had been deliberately sealed by someone who had intended for it to be preserved and found. Inside the cavity, wrapped in oilcloth and resting in a metal box, was a ledger bound in leather. The handwriting was her father's. Eleanor carried the ledger down the spiral stairs and sat in the gray afternoon light, her hands trembling as she opened it. The first entry was dated September 1883, the very month that Thomas's troubles had begun. These were not records of weather and ships. These were confessions, detailed and careful, documenting the truth about the copper shipment. John Cassidy had witnessed something. He had been at the northern docks the night the ingots were loaded, and had seen them taken, not by Thomas, but by 3 men carrying the seal of the Harding Company. He had documented the date, the hour, and the faces of the men involved. And then he had done something that cost him everything. He had kept quiet. He had been afraid. The Hardings were powerful. He was a lighthouse keeper, a man who could be made to disappear. He had a wife, a daughter, a son, so he had sealed his knowledge away in the heart of the light itself, with a note written at the end. If anyone finds this, know that Thomas Cassidy is innocent. Know that his good name was stolen by theft. Know that the lighthouse should still stand. And know that some of us were too afraid to speak, when speaking would have meant everything. Eleanor read these words by the fading light of that November afternoon, and understood that her father's silence had been not simple cowardice, but something more complex, an acknowledgement of his own powerlessness, paired with an act of defiance. At least he had left a record. At least he had tried to ensure that somewhere, someday, the truth would not disappear entirely. She also found, pressed between the final pages, a letter addressed to her specifically, sealed and unbroken for 36 years. She opened it and read, "My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I have been taken from this world, and you have been wise and patient enough to find what I could not bring myself to speak aloud. Forgive me for my fear, for my weakness, for the shadow this has cast on your life. You have always understood that the lighthouse is not merely a structure. It is a promise. I leave this truth in your hands because I trust that you will know what to do with it. Your loving father, John." Spent the next 3 weeks going through the ledger entry by entry, verifying dates against her own memory and against the records still held in the town archive. She cross-referenced the names. The 3 men her father had identified were all still living in or near Copper Reach, all in the employ of the Harding organization. She found, in a separate section of her father's ledger, a meticulous account of the copper's probable destination, a series of shipments to a private foundry upstate, where the ingots would be refined and sold under false provenance. Her father had even documented the financial records that proved the Hardings had profited significantly from the theft. He had been systematic. He had been thorough. He had been gathering proof, even as he remained silent. What Eleanor did with this knowledge took her another month to decide. She could have taken the ledger to the town council or to the newspapers. She could have burned it all and let the past remain buried. But she understood that her father's final act, leaving this truth in the beacon itself, had been an act of hope. He believed that someone would find it. He believed that someone would do what he could not. Eleanor began, quietly, to make copies of the most damning entries. She wrote letters to the state attorney's office, documenting what she had found. She sent copies to the few honest people she knew: the old librarian, the doctor who had treated Thomas in his final illness, a judge who had always seemed troubled by the verdict. She was careful, she was methodical, she was patient. The Hardings, when they became aware of what Eleanor had done, moved quickly to discredit her. They claimed she had fabricated the ledger. They sent their lawyers to examine it, and when the examination proved its authenticity, they changed their story. They claimed that John Cassidy had been confused, that his memory had been unreliable, that the entries were the ravings of a disturbed mind. But they had underestimated the power of Eleanor's patience and the power of a paper trail that could not be denied. The state attorney's office opened a formal investigation. Other documents emerged, records that had been hidden, that Eleanor had found through her careful research. The three men named in her father's ledger eventually confessed, each hoping to secure leniency. The Hardings found themselves facing charges. The trial occurred over 6 weeks in the spring of 1892. Copper Reach, which had been so ready to believe ill of Eleanor's husband, found itself forced to confront the truth. The Hardings' guilt was undeniable and documented. The family's response was swift and ruthless. They left town, liquidating their holdings quickly, removing themselves to a larger city where their money and influence might insulate them from scrutiny. They did not go quietly, spreading rumors that Eleanor had stolen the ledger, that she had fabricated entries, that she was mad with revenge. But the evidence was too substantial. The families who had believed in Eleanor's husband's guilt, slowly, shamefully, began to acknowledge what had always been true. The town held a service to formally clear Thomas Cassidy's name. Eleanor did not attend. Instead, she remained at the lighthouse, working steadily to restore it. She hired a craftsman to repair the mechanism, to clean the great lens, to ensure that the light, once lit again, would burn as it had in her father's time. She worked alongside the craftsman, her hands moving with the same precision her father had taught her. She read his ledgers and journals, and she began her own entries in a new volume, documenting her restoration of the light with the same meticulous care he had shown. On the summer solstice of 1892, exactly 1 year after she had purchased the lighthouse, Eleanor lit the beacon for the first time in 7 years. She had worked with the harbor authority to ensure that ships would be notified. She had used her father's old protocols. She had prepared the mechanism herself. When the light came on, cutting through the June evening like a blade through darkness, the beam reaching out across the water in that perfect, fractured arc that the Fresnel lens created, Eleanor stood in the lamp room and wept. The town came to watch. The same people who had mocked her, who had laughed at her purchase, who had believed the lies about her husband, they came to stand on the shore and watch the light sweep across the water. The lighthouse keeper's cottage was rebuilt. A new keeper was hired, a young man from the next town over, who would live in the house and tend the light. Eleanor did not seek the position for herself, though she could have. Instead, she became the lighthouse's historian and keeper of records, maintaining her father's ledgers, keeping the mechanism in perfect repair, teaching the young keeper everything she knew. The families who had profited from the Hardings' corruption found themselves quietly isolated by society. The townspeople's collective shame began to express itself as a kind of restitution. They came to Eleanor with small kindnesses, with employment, with a return of dignity that she had never asked for. She accepted all of it with grace, understanding that people need to atone, need to be forgiven, and that this need is its own kind of healing. She understood that vindication is not vengeance. It is simply the restoration of what was always true. Eleanor Cassidy lived another 32 years after she lit that lighthouse. She never married again. She never left Copper Reach. She became a familiar figure on the shore, a woman in dark clothes who walked the rocky perimeter of Lighthouse Point, who climbed the spiral stairs each day to ensure the mechanism was in perfect order, who maintained her father's ledgers and added her own entries in the same careful hand. Children born in the town after her restoration of the light grew up understanding that the lighthouse was not merely a practical structure. It was a place where truth had been preserved, where an act of patient defiance had changed everything. They learned that her husband's name had been stolen and reclaimed. They learned that her father had been afraid, but had left a record anyway. They learned that she had been willing to wait, to work, to tend a light in the darkness until someone, herself, was ready to bring it fully into flame. When Eleanor died at 80 years old, the town held a service at the lighthouse. They did not make speeches about her vindication or her courage, because Eleanor would not have wanted that. Instead, they simply kept the light burning. They kept it burning, as she had kept it burning, as her father had kept it burning, as a promise made to the lost that there would always be something in the darkness, reaching toward them, asking them to come home. When the town laughed at Eleanor Cassidy for buying that old lighthouse for $75, they were laughing at their own blindness. Laughter is a form of ignorance. It blinds us to the strength of the quiet, to the power of patience, to the grace of those who are willing to tend a light when the world has chosen darkness. Eleanor did not buy the lighthouse because she believed she would be vindicated. She bought it because she understood that some truths cannot be spoken aloud, and so they must be preserved in the very architecture of the world, waiting for someone brave enough to find them. She bought it because her father had taught her that a single light is greater than great darkness, if someone is patient enough to tend it. And when she lit that beam, when she sent it out across the water in that perfect, fractured arc, she was not merely illuminating the harbor, she was illuminating the truth itself. She was saying, I am here, and I remember, and what was stolen will not be forgotten. Thank you for joining us today. We know you're watching from 1,000 different places, living 1,000 different stories, and we're grateful that you've spent this time with us. If you've ever found yourself written off by the people around you, if you've ever had to tend a light in your own darkness while the world looked away, we'd love to hear that part of your story. Tell us in the comments. Before you go, we'd like to ask you this. What is a time when you found yourself underestimated? And what small, persistent thing did you do anyway? What light did you keep burning when no one thought it mattered? Until next time, stay close to the truth, and know that even the oldest lights are worth tending.